Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another episode of the All Might Be Edified discussions on servant leadership. I'm Keith Pankow, the host and producer of this podcast, and I have the wonderful privilege to be here with Ben Beckhart, who's a good friend of my uncle, and I was introduced to him in my temporary assignment in Mexico, which is fun to consider and to think about. Although I am usually live in the United States, I've been living in Mexico for around 4 months now, and this is actually the first domestically produced episode of the podcast, as both Ben and I are in Mexico, as Ben's a Mexican national. And most of my other guests have been in the US while I've been in Mexico recording. So this is fun to be in the same country and recording and to have a great dialogue, even though we come from different backgrounds and different cultures. Now, Ben is a bicultural, bilingual, entrepreneurial CEO with strategic and operational leadership competencies and experience in the consumer goods industry. He builds and transforms businesses through brand development, distribution expansion, innovation, and by working with high performance individuals, particularly in challenging market and competitive situations. He has a diverse background of over 20 years in the profit and loss management business, motivated by a culture that emphasizes growth, competition, and spirit of leadership. He seeks to contribute to growth and transformation and make a difference in everything that he does. He has had key leadership roles in many companies that you may recognize: Sabritos, Frito Lay, Disney, General Mills, Wrigley Jr., and the Hunter Project, and many others spanning multiple countries. He is the current Chief Engender Officer at Beckhart Engendra. He studied physics at the University of California, Irvine, and received his Bachelor of Science in Economics and Finance from the Wharton School, and also has an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Ben is the author of the book Lead with Character, Build a Better Future. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that wonderful book. And I'm so glad to have you here today, Ben. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Keith. Thank you for having me here. And I'm very excited to have this conversation and really to get our audience highly motivated with the subjects that we're going to touch upon.
I love that thought. I love getting people highly motivated about good topics. So what wonderful words to hear. So tell me a little bit about your book and what motivated you to write this book.
Well, thank you. Look, my book's entitled Lead with Character. And what motivated me really is that I've been working on leadership for many, many, many years. And leadership really is a journey. What I found out through my career is that although I was seeking guidance in terms of becoming a better leader, and I wanted to be a better leader, I felt that, at least in the corporate environment, I got a lot of leadership training, but it wasn't enough. We were learning about competencies and how these competencies could help you become, let's say, yes, more effective and perhaps more efficient, and perhaps even fit, in better with a company in a corporate environment. But I felt that something was missing. And I started looking around at those people that I truly admired, and I tried to see, what really made them different and made them what I call leaders with character. And I started putting together these different traits, that they had, and they weren't part of those competencies. And those different traits is really kind of like the secret sauce. And it's not really secret, but it was really part of those elements that made a difference. And so I started saying, always a top leader, a competency, for example, would be, setting an agenda or being able to formulate a vision and have people follow that, align those people to achieve that vision. But also other competencies, including, working in a team or thinking outside of the box, or perhaps, they talked a lot about, yes, being innovative and by the way, being able to negotiate, these are all competencies, but they didn't talk about having curiosity or having compassion or showing resilience. And these are very important traits. And I thought, well, why don't I share them? Because those are things that I needed to work on. For example, I need to work on compassion. I needed to work on humility as one of those lead with character traits. And I saw that those people that were really, not only in the political field, but in the business field or in the academic field, the people that showed compassion, humility, resilience, but also set a vision for everyone, were making a huge difference. So let me stop there. And that's what compelled me to write the book. Let me share my experiences throughout life. I didn't want to make this an academic book, Keith. I wanted to make sure that I could share it with a lot of my anecdotes. When I'm talking about someone that espouses these traits in a very positive fashion, it's usually somebody else. And when I was missing out on these traits, it's probably about me, failing a little bit, but learning as well.
Well, that's great. And I think wonderful tie-in to servant leadership with leading with character, and especially needing to continually grow and learn and become a better leader. And it's one thing to be an efficient leader, but it's a totally different thing to be a leader that's both efficient and empowers and builds and strengthens other people as well.
True. And I'm glad you said that, Keith, because one of the things we always forget as leaders is that you can't really build towards your enterprise, or you can't build your organization, or you can't really get, that project going, or whatever your endeavor is, if you don't build your people first. How do you develop and grow your people first? And that's what and when you talk about servant leadership, now I talk about leading with character is really putting people first, but truly developing, growing your people, making your people leaders so you can grow your organization, whatever it is, or your endeavor or your project at the end of the day. The real world has some great character leaders or servant leaders as well, but the real world has a lot of command and control leaders, that want to lead through instilling fear amongst people. And yes, it is very effective. And yes, it works, but it's not sustainable. You burn people out.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing a lot about that in the US with what is being typically referred to as the Great Resignation. And we're seeing all these people wanting to move from jobs or move organizations or just being burnout altogether. And especially as we face this global pandemic and people start to really re-rack their priorities, working for a leader that is toxic or instills fear in them, it's very easy when you're faced with a change in priorities or a change in life goals to recognize I need something different. And I want someone who inspires me and invites me to be better and do better.
Absolutely, Keith. And, it's funny how, you read certain articles on the Great Resignation. I've read several articles on reputable magazines like The Economist, or, even newspapers like the New York Times, or even the Washington Post, or even a McKinsey study. They're trying to find an economic reason to this, or let's call a health and wellness reasons to it. Well, I'm not saying it's wrong, but frankly, it's a void in leadership. Because if the leaders within these companies would give people purpose and they would make them feel that they're making a difference, people would stick around. They're leaving for, primarily because they're not happy with whatever they're doing, or they're not happy with their boss. So they're lacking engagement. And, one of the things I want to share with you, one of the things I found out about writing, when I was writing the book, is that, younger generations and people like you, as opposed to me, I'm a little bit, I hate to say, I'm going to use the word seasoned. I like to think of myself as young, but, seasoned is in the sense when I was starting in my job, the job market, I remember, we were very eager to please. And if somebody said, you got to do this, you got to jump, we would say, well, how high? And nowadays, younger people are better educated. They're they're technologically savvy. Their education is focused on a lot of critical thought, which in my time, it wasn't, we weren't supposed to question to begin with. No, there's a lot of critical thought. And most importantly, the younger generations want to make a difference with whatever they're doing. They want to make a difference in their community. They want to make a difference in their family. They want to make a difference. They want to make a difference at work. And if work is not allowing them or enabling them to make a difference, they're not going to engage. And who is within an organization? You can call it a military organization. You can call it an academic organization. You can call it a political organization. It doesn't matter. In a corporate organization, really, it's the leader that makes the difference and connects with the followers or with the contributors or with the stakeholders, ensuring that that stakeholder or that contributor is actually making a difference. And by making a difference, aligning to whatever the vision or the, and the mission and the purpose of that company or that project. Again, I say, I use a lot of words because we forget. Sometimes you say, oh, that's just the company making money. No. Yes, we're there to make money to be sustainable. But at the end of the day, if that person doesn't feel they're making a difference, they're disengaged. And you're right, the Great Resignation. And I don't know why people are not saying the Great Resignation is about failed leadership, period. Huh?
I hear exactly what you're saying, and I don't see people talking about it. And that's exactly what it is. And it's funny that we have this disconnect because I think more than ever, we're aware that people quit bad leaders. They don't quit bad jobs. True. But we aren't making this connection of a large number of people quitting their jobs probably means we have a leadership void that we should address in a different way. And we're looking for all these alternative explanations when really we should be how do we become better leaders? How do we engage people that makes them want to be a part of this organization, want to be a part of this culture, want to be part of what we're doing here?
I see it. A lot of the reports are talking about how people are burnt out because of the COVID, having to be working from home, working a lot more hours, not having that human touch. But if you're a leader, if you really dig, you go a little bit deeper. And I think with leadership with character, you're leading with character. I talk about compassion, and compassion has to do with, putting yourself in that person's shoes. And as a leader, sometimes you're also going through a hard time, and you're also having your own problems. But you got to think about others first and saying, what are my followers? What are my constituents? How are they doing? And what we're not doing is, yes, we're having a lot of Zoom calls or Teams or Google Meets, or whatever you want to call them, a lot of video calls and video conferences. But after the video call, you're not picking up the phone, just the phone or the video, and saying, you know what, tell me, how are you feeling? How are you doing with all of this? And one of the things that we are experiencing, and there's a lot of reports about this, is that people are working longer hours, and they're spending a lot of time meeting after meeting after meeting on a Zoom. That was already happening before COVID, for example. But no one's really taking 5 minutes off or 10 minutes off to say, by the way, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Do you feel your job is making a difference? Are we doing 2-minute reports? What's bothering you? What's bothering you? Because now that you're sitting at home, by the way, perhaps what's bothering you is that your kids are sick, and we're not asking people that because we still think we're at the office, and that we leave home, that there's that limit between the office and home. It's not there. So compassion is a very important part of being a leader with character, which has to do, by the way, with setting, well, that's another thing about leading with character. I talk about selflessness. And selflessness really means, setting the interest of the others, setting them first before your own, which has to do with servant leadership, by the way. So if we were to talk a little bit, we'd probably be able to achieve or to gain a lot more engagement. Okay, if we were a little bit more curious and started asking more questions. I don't know. What do you think about that, Keith?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think a question that we don't ask, that I've been thinking a lot more about, is asking people, what do you need? And just allowing them to tell you what they need, because it might be work related, it might be personally related, but at least allowing people to express what they need and hearing them. And we might not be able to fix all those needs, but at least opening that dialogue helps us to see them as people. And I have a great example of that, being here in Mexico. I had to leave my family. I left my work. I'm still managing my team and trying to stay connected to them as much as possible. And admittedly, I'm not doing as good of a job with this distance between us as I would like to do, but I'm trying to connect in with them and touch base with them. But I had a couple of good examples from some of my senior officers in the Coast Guard, and just out of the blue, they'd send me a note. I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing. How's your family? Does your family need anything at all? Is there anything that I can do to support your family? And to have a senior officer who I know is extremely busy just send a little message like that, and I'm probably not going to take them up on their offer to send them over to check on my family, but at least shows me they're caring about me and they're thinking about me, even though I'm very disconnected from my normal job.
Well, but that's a great example. But you see, then you question, my question there, is it because your senior Coast Guard officer is a character leader or a servant leader that he called you, or is it institutionalized within the Coast Guard? I mean, maybe I don't want to ask that question, but that would be fantastic if it's part of the culture of the Coast Guard, because then that means that it's replicable. You can reapply it elsewhere.
I think it's somewhat part of the culture, but not enough. I would argue not enough. And I think these two examples are leaders that lead with character. They're servant leaders. So I think it's tough to really answer the question in light of them, but I look at it in a couple of different ways. We have our mission sets in the Coast Guard are very humanitarian focused. So I think it invites a natural connection to people that care about people, is one thing that I've observed over time. But institutionally, I think we stifle it in some ways that are unhelpful. And we've been talking a lot about this, and I'll give one good example because it's something that's important to me, and it probably will be solved after I leave the Coast Guard, but I love the organization. And so it's important to me that we find an answer, or we start learning to adapt to the reality of the world we live in now. And one of the things is, a few years ago, they changed the retirement system for the military. The old retirement system, the pension system, was at the end of 20 years, you'd get 50% of your base pay. Every year after 20 years, you get 2.5% more out of that percentage. Well, they came up with a new policy, which I think is better if it's done right. It empowers the younger generation to have more control over their own future, more control over their own retirement. But these changes created some challenges for us that we're not addressing. And so the new system, immediately you can put into what we call a thrift savings plan, or it's somewhat like a 401k. And so the Coast Guard will do a certain percentage of matching into that thrift savings plan. And that stays with you in your time. And if you decide to leave it 5 years or 10 years, you get to take that with you as a future retirement that's continuing to accrue, money, which is good. And if you end up staying till 20 years, instead of getting the 50% retirement that we get now, you get 40%. So if you did it right, it's a much better deal because you're investing over time and you're still getting 40% pension. So in long term, it's good. But what I think we failed as an organization so far to adapt to is the reality that the people in let's say the 6 to 12 year mark they've loved the organization, they've had a good time, maybe they've hated the organization and they just want to get out and they're trying to honor their initial commitment. We've invested a lot of money into training them, into building an expertise. So you look at these people like right around 5-6 years when they're starting to make that decision about their future with the organization, there's a lot of investment. Well, maybe we give them an extra school or we send them to grad school. So we keep them around till another, maybe that 8 to 10 year mark. Well, now, if we haven't shown them that the organization matters, we've now given them an easy way to leave because they've got 10 years of accrued investment in basically a 401k. So they don't have to worry as much about the pension. Whereas now, like me, I spent 9 years in the Navy and I hated the leadership of the Navy. I love my mission, but I just had some of the worst leaders I've ever experienced in my life in the Navy. And I wanted to leave, but I loved the Navy, but I just wanted to leave. But I didn't want to lose that time. So I looked for other ways to work for the government that I could keep that time. And so I switched over. So I'm a perfect example of someone, if I had 9 years of an investment plan that I could take with me, I would have said later, US government, I'm going to do something else and invest in myself. But I was like, well, I want the pension. So I stuck around. And I think there's a big majority that fall into that category that we're not catering to, or that we're not mindful of. How do we help them buy into the organization more? Because most of them love the missions of the organization. There's just these bureaucratic processes they might not buy into, or they might fear the assignment process because we move quite often and the assignment process isn't usually transparent. So it's very hard to figure out where we're going. And I think there's little ways as an organization we could care more about that person to make their decision to stay easier. And then we don't lose that investment and all that skill.
You got me thinking right now, and it's a very interesting point because on the one hand, you have institutionalized policies, so to speak, that help retain people within an organization. But that's, and I was very careful to say help retain people, but does it keep them motivated and inspired? No. And then you mentioned, I think, the organizations like the Navy, or in this case, the Coast Guard, or some companies have some fantastic visions and missions. And I think the missions of and the purpose of both the Coast Guard and the Navy are very noble ones to begin with. No? Those are institutional columns that do help, Keith. Helps their elements, so to speak. But humans we're quite complex. We need different things that kind of tie us together, weave into our lives. And I think the other one is really the leaders that we have, the bosses that we have. Now I'm going to be a little bit more broad. I'll just include other organizations. I think that one of the things that I found in my career, and I saw in the organizations that foster different, let's call it assignments, were able to keep people longer. And not only that they kept them longer, but it helped develop two things. One, new bases of not only skills and knowledge and leadership traits, I want to call them, and yes, leadership competencies by having different assignments where you require, say, different parts of your persona, to come forth and to show that you're able to bring them forth, because leadership really is about learning new things all the time and about learning stuff that you're not very comfortable with too, to tell you the truth, both technical and non-technical. But these companies had, these environments that have different assignments help, because you feel like you're learning something, but also you've got to create a network where that person doesn't feel they're going to fail, or if they fail, that it's okay to fail. All right. Because they're learning. you don't want to be failing because of negligence. You want to fail because you tried, and then it's interesting how you mentioned how some assignments cannot be transparent. So you already talked about how it's important to create the transparency in the process. And also the other thing that you mentioned, it's interesting because I think people also value when you're willing to not break the policies, but to be flexible enough that you're willing to make exceptions for different people, because then that also creates, a special sense of, hey, what I call, the social contract. And I think a lot of work environments have really forgotten about how you build that social psychological contract with each and every one of your stakeholders, whether you're followers, you want to call them followers, you want to call them employees, and there's a social contract even with your suppliers, or even with your constituents, and the stakeholders. What we talk is, who's your most important stakeholder when you talk about, say, military services? Well, I think it's your nation, it's your citizens. I like to think, because you're upholding the Constitution. So when we think about a company, we say, stakeholders are, yes, shareholders, but it's also the consumers, it's also your employees. But this is where leadership has to be courageous enough. And again, in leadership with character, one of the traits to talk about is courage. And we talk about, innovation and, the thinking outside of the box. I don't really like it because it has to do with creativity, but you really have to promote creativity, which is also another trait of leading with character. If you allow creativity to break, to sometimes what I call, kill the sacred cows. You may have some policies that made a lot of sense 50 years ago. Are they making sense today? And if people see that you're willing to, with creativity, come up with new policies and do away, with the sacred cows of the past, whether they're policies, those cows, or whether they're people, that's another important thing. But you need that courageous leadership, which has to do with leading with character, as long as it makes sense to the final vision that you're trying to achieve, you know what I mean? Or that mission that you're trying to comply with. So I think you would build in a lot of engagement. A leader with character seeks to build engagement, and you brought a word there, engagement. You build engagement by caring about people. That doesn't mean you forget about your mission. That doesn't mean you don't forget about, you forget about what you stand for, and the great things they're trying to reach. It's funny because there's a lot of institutions that believe in, to become institutional, an institution, you got to have policies. But there's a point at which policies can be suffocating leadership. And this is where leaders have to break those policies. What are your thoughts on that?
I really love this concept, both of courage and curiosity, and the combination of the two together. And I'll start first with courage. And I think sometimes you're absolutely right. There's a level of courage that's needed for a good leader. And whether that's breaking policy, challenging policy, or pushing people, or even fighting for people when others might not. There's all these different ways courage can manifest. And I think sometimes in today's world, we've created an environment with cancel culture and all these different things that it's created fear. And too often fear is ruling over this courage. It's so vitally needed for good leadership. And we kind of talked as we were preparing to hit record about the need for dialogue. Dialogue is the true way we embrace the gift of diversity, and we get the benefits of it through understanding the way different people think. And if we allow fear to overrule over courage, we create an environment where people aren't willing to speak up, not just the leaders, the staff. And when that happens, we're not getting the best of our team members. And so we have to find a way to break through these barriers of fear and show courageous leadership that invites other people to speak their mind while also being respectful and courteous and being true to the organizational culture.
Yeah. It's interesting because when there's stability and when there's certainty, you're less likely to find courageous leadership. I think we're going to find more courageous leadership right now during these crises that we're living. I'll give you a quick example. One of the companies that are one of the most admirable companies that I've worked for, but I had, frankly, I have little admiration for it, is General Mills. General Mills is, is a Fortune 100, is one of the top 10 food companies in the world. but they don't like to rock the boat. They like certainty. They like as a result today, they're not a high performance high performing company. And why? Because what they seek is conforming. And I remember having a conversation with the CEO back then, and I said, what, do you realize that over 35% of your revenues are sold into Walmart? And I said, what are you going to do to reduce that dependency and ensure that this business is sustainable for the next 50 years? Because in a matter of time, it's going to be 50% of your revenues are going to be sold into Walmart and Sam's and different organizations the like. And he said, well, we got to work with Walmart. And he didn't like it at all. And what I was doing is I was challenging the status quo. So I was seen immediately as somebody that was not a team player. I'm like, oh, no, wait a minute. It's not that I don't want to be a team player. Is that I'm actually asking you to challenge the status quo. So today, General Mills is a company that is not performing very well, even though food companies are performing extraordinarily well in this crisis. So they're performing well along with other food companies, but are they showing, breakthrough innovation? The answer is no. Are they having great leaders, that are being, say, exported to other companies, so to speak? That's a different no. And now they could beg to differ, and I'm willing to debate with them, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that you either conform, or you're better off going somewhere else. And so, of course, I went somewhere else. But today in crisis, if you think about it, it's a great opportunity, because when you ask, well, what can you do? Well, it depends on the leader. So clearly, and by the way, it's interesting. One of the best CEOs that PepsiCo has had left General Mills many years ago, and then he became the CEO of PepsiCo and took PepsiCo to some of the best performance measured by Wall Street in years. So what I'm getting to is our cultures that do suffocate that, and they don't want to break. But and if you don't have a leader that is at the top that's willing to change things, it's not going to happen. Sadly, it's going to come. It has to start from the top. It won't, this whole grassroots movements with organizations, it's very difficult, to tell you the truth. You got to have a revolutionary admiral or a revolutionary CEO or a revolutionary politician to really change things, or a revolutionary dean, to make things change. Or you're going to have the crisis that we're living today that forges leadership that says, we really need somebody different to steer this organization and move it forward in a different direction to be able to manage these crises that we're having today, like the one we're having. So now it's funny because, this is the first time in many, many years, Keith, that the world is, the playground is the same for the world in terms of the COVID crisis. But I remember living the H1N1 crisis in Mexico and having to have conversations with corporate. Back then, corporate was in England, or even with the U.S., and they would look at me like, "What the hell are you talking about?" Or foreign exchange crises, and they're looking at me like, "What are you talking about?" They never understood it because they weren't living it. They couldn't empathize with it. So now finally, we have a very even playing field where this is a fantastic ground for leaders to emerge, or for leaders to be forged, or for leaders to truly demonstrate if they're the leaders that can move the companies forward instead of complaining about supply chain issues. Give me a break. 3 years ago, before COVID, I said, if I'm in the US and I'm depending, my supply chain is depending on China. It's the same example I gave you about sales depending to Walmart. And so, what's new? What's new is that suddenly it's even playing field. And why didn't somebody do something about it in terms of reducing supply chain dependence on China 4, 5, 6 years ago? And the answer is simple: because it costs more money, because it takes a lot more energy, because you got to be a courageous leader to say, what? We got to look at things differently, because one day, perhaps, China may decide not to supply us. So this may be a controversial podcast. I hope it is, in a good sense, and it gets people thinking about what may be the next thing we got to be thinking about. But go ahead, Keith.
I agree. I agree completely. And that ties perfectly into curiosity, right? So if we're talking about things that require us to engage the inner dialogue of ourselves to be able to answer back, that's inviting us to open up curiosity within ourselves. And too often we avoid topics that may or be quote unquote controversial. And that's really stifling curiosity within ourselves because we're not embracing that inner dialogue about how would I even answer these questions? How would I do so that's in a way that's respectful, but still true to myself? And that principle of curiosity is so vital. And Dr. Kavanaugh, when I met with her, the great leader at the Lastinger Center at the University of Florida, she talked about how this thought that the creating an environment where ideas can flourish is crucial. And if we're focused on conformity or we're focused on the status quo, we're not inviting ideas to flourish. We're inviting people to see things the way the manual says to see things. And we're not opening that inner dialogue so that people can also become the best versions of themselves, but then can also put forth their best effort to the team or to the organization. I love the way you connected curiosity and courage together because it really does take courage in today's world with so many competing interests and so many different dialogues and so many different issues on social justice and inequality and equity and all these terms that we throw around. It takes a courageous leader to open a space that allows people to talk there. And you have to be an engaging leader because there will be times you'll have to shut people down for crossing a line or crossing a boundary. And that's where the courage really steps in. But if you do it in the right way, it will broaden the ability to create curiosity.
Oh, absolutely. And I think people, that's the other thing. Followers in general are, sometimes we underestimate them in the sense that we think they can't evaluate. I don't want to use the word judge necessarily, but they can't evaluate the situation or gather. And they will be able to detect the leader who has to be firm and courageous when a colleague is dishonest or is, dishonest, for example, is embezzling and it's hurting everybody else's interest, and they will understand that courageous, firm leader that needs to fire that person that is hurting the well-being of everyone, the well-being of the worth of the company or the organization or the values of a military organization too. If you're an officer that, I'm going to go to an extreme point, but I'm sure that you've ran into this situation. If there's an officer that has molested a child or sexually, assaulted, a child or a woman, if it's a man and a woman, then, it's conduct unbecoming, and a challenge, a leader that's courageous is going to take the steps to not only discipline, but oust that person from the organization, to tell you the truth, Now, I went to an extreme that I know that you and I know happens in any kind of environment, by the way. But also the courage to, a courageous leader is one that creates an environment that is safe for people to ask questions and to be courageous to sustain criticism sometimes from others. And the example has to do with General Mills. At General Mills, Mexico, I said, we got to make sure that we expand our distribution, that we are selling, let's grow with Walmart, and let's grow with Walmart every year. But I want Walmart to stay, to be a low percentage of our sales. That means we got to find other people to sell to, and it takes a lot more work. And when people in corporate would ask me, well, why aren't you selling more at Walmart? Hey, I'm selling very well at Walmart, and we have a good share. But, I had to be courageous and said, it's important to develop others. And we have ideas from my people about how we can expand distribution elsewhere, not only geographically, but in other channels. Or, we were already thinking about how selling directly to people and so on and so forth. So it also takes courage. I'll tell you where sometimes when people challenge you as a leader with their curiosity, rather than stomping it down, it takes courage to say, you know what? Let me listen to what this person has to say. And let me, like you said earlier, establish the dialogue. So why are you asking to tell me more? Why are you asking that question? Show me, what are you thinking that I'm missing? Or what led you to that question that really I had not thought about? And then the dialogue begins. And you can come up with something like you said, your follower is a lot happier and thinks, hey, this person's paying attention to me. This person cares about what I'm thinking. Well, this person thinks is giving value to my question and my curiosity, and it's not stamping it down. Huh?
When you were talking about some of these things, in the military strategist in me always thinks about how bad it is to have what we refer to as choke points or single point of failures. A choke point is somewhere that it drives you into a certain area where you can be easily ambushed because there's no way to easily get out of there and you're stuck. Or, these single point of failures, if there's only one person that you have to rely on to do a job, if they get sick or they die or they're incapacitated, everything can fall apart with a single point of failure. One of my personal leadership philosophies that I've taken throughout my whole career is when I join a team, I always try to put myself out of work. I don't try to give away my work. I try to train everyone around me to be able to do what I do and to understand what I do and to be able to take my job and to put me out of work down the road. Now, I work hard and I try to do as much as I can, but I want everyone around me to feel like they could rise to become that position that I've inherited by gift of just an assignment change. And by doing that, it's amazing how people flourish. And even the people that are content, sitting in their lane and doing their own job still like their lane and they like their job better because they get a better vision. And when someone's out for sickness or a birth of a child, we talk about needing to create these atmospheres where where moms can feel comfortable and dads can feel comfortable taking parental leave. If we don't create these support systems in our work environment, then people can't feel comfortable. And so it gives people an opportunity to recognize that my personal life doesn't have to be completely separate and take a back seat to all my professional endeavors.
No, not at all. I mean, on the contrary, your personal life makes a huge difference in your professional endeavors. I mean, and I hate to say it, if you're doing well in your personal life, you're going to do well in your professional life. And I'm thinking in Spanish, but we call it vasos conductores. They're conducting vessels. It goes from one to the next. And if the pressure is high in one vessel, it's going to pass on to the next one, and vice versa, or low pressure to high pressure. And I mean, it's just normal physics. I'd like to call it, or it's called entropy as well. And you got to put energy to put some order into that as well. So quite fascinating. But you were saying also, it's interesting because it has to do also with being selfless. We're talking earlier about how you build. I always thought, how do you go? Growth is a very important criteria for me, because when I was building these companies, and I knew that if I can grow the companies, I could pay people better, but most importantly, I could give them promotions, and I can give them promotions in the sense of higher responsibility, more scope and more depth their jobs. And therefore, they were going to be growing as people. They were going to be growing as leaders. They were going to be growing as executives. They were going to be growing as collaborators. And so growth was really important. And the only way I could grow the company is by growing them, which goes back to, I remember, I went into the job market 30 years ago where we all try to become indispensable. And I used to tell my people, you have to become dispensable. You got to become someone that they can move or throw away, in the good sense, because that means that you've developed a team and a group of people, exactly what you were saying at the beginning. And that has to do, again, with leading with character, which has to do with selflessness. Selflessness is you build your people so you can build the company, so they can grow and they can build others. And at the end of the day, selflessness has to do with collaboration. Offline, we're talking about the video that you saw, and this video about social being, what did I call it? Social civility. Social civility is important because we learn to collaborate. And the one things that makes us humans different to other species is that we collaborate, and we collaborate to achieve fantastic things. We collaborate to build a aircraft carrier. We collaborate to build these amazing buildings. We collaborate, we collaborated worldwide to come up with vaccines. Maybe they're not perfect yet, but, to come up with vaccines that today are at least, putting a break on this, on the coronavirus. We collaborate to reach peace. We collaborate, to have economic growth. But if we don't collaborate, which means that we don't trust each other, Okay, which means that we have no social stability. What do? We destroy. And that's why leadership is so, but humans have this great ability to come together to find solutions to our biggest problems. That's leadership. That's servant leadership. And that's leading with character. And when we forget that we need to develop and grow our people, we're no longer collaborating. We're no longer being leaders with character. And sadly, we see a company going in a spiral. General Electric going in a spiral downwards. A lot of these big companies that General Electric, by the way, this great company that had survived for years and years and years, and now it's just falling apart. Why? Because of poor leadership. And we see nations. I mean, you and I have seen smaller countries or countries that don't emerge because there's no collaboration, because there's poor leadership. But what do you think about that?
No, I love it. I love it. We've been talking for quite some time. And before we start to wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a challenge, because I love this conversation and I love this idea of courage and curiosity. So my challenge for you listening to this podcast is to think about how you can be both more courageous and invite greater curiosity with those around you. Because I think as you look at the ways you can be more courageous and you look at the ways you can invite curiosity, you're going to see an amplification of both courage and curiosity in all those around you. Well, Ben, I've really enjoyed it. And this has been a wonderful conversation. Any final thoughts to wrap up with?
Well, thank you. Well, one of my final thoughts is really, it's just a question that I want for your audience is, what kind of leader do you want to be when you grow up? And it will leave a lot of thought there. And why? Because we never grow up. If you're curious, you never grow up. You keep growing, no? But at the end of the day, each and every one of you out in the audience will be in a position of leadership. And if not, you're already there and you're creating an influence. And you influence people either positively or negatively through your thoughts, through your gestures, through your words, and through your actions. And that's the question then, is what kind of actions, thought, gestures are you going to espouse so that you leave a positive or a negative example. Leaders with character leave a positive example that transcends. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. And as you were talking earlier, I'm glad you tied it all up with that point, because when you mentioned not wanting to admit your age and that you're getting older, I thought about how curiosity really does keep us younger. And then you close with that. So I thought it was perfect. So thanks again for joining us. Thanks all you listening for joining us. This has been another episode of That All Might Be Edified, discussions on servant leadership. Please like, share, review, and subscribe to the podcast so that others may find it. And have a wonderful day.